July 1st, 1942. The morning sun crept over the towering gray stone buildings of West Point, casting long shadows across the parade grounds as 18-year-old John Winters stepped off the train at Highland Falls Station. His heart pounded against his ribs as he straightened his civilian tie, a gesture that would soon become foreign to him. Clutching his small suitcase, all he was permitted to bring to the United States Military Academy, he swallowed hard, his throat dry despite the humidity that already hung in the Hudson Valley air. The station buzzed with dozens of young men like him, all straight-backed with anticipation, all destined to become part of something far greater than themselves in a world at war. 30 minutes later, as John stood in formation on the plane at West Point, a voice shattered the nervous silence. "Drop those bags, mister!" The upperclassman's face appeared inches from John's, eyes blazing with intensity that seemed to burn right through him. "Pick them up! Drop them again!" Sweat beaded on John's forehead as he struggled to comply with the rapid-fire commands. Around him, nearly 500 other new cadets experienced the same jarring introduction to military life, their first taste of reception day, or R-Day, at West Point during the most accelerated training program in the Academy's history. No one in that incoming class knew the significance of what was happening. As the world burned in global conflict, the Army had shortened the traditional 4-year West Point experience to just 3 years, creating the most intense military education program ever implemented. John Winters and his classmates would become the speed-forged officers that America desperately needed as the war in Europe and the Pacific demanded more leaders than the traditional system could produce. What happened in the next 24 hours would break many of these young men, but those who remained would form the backbone of America's officer corps at a pivotal moment when innovation, disobedience to standard protocols, and sheer courage would determine the fate of millions. John Winters grew up in Carterville, Illinois, a coal mining town where his father worked as the local doctor. The Great Depression had hit hard, but Dr. Winters managed to maintain his practice, treating miners for everything from black lung to broken bones, often accepting payment in vegetables or freshly butchered meat instead of cash. Young John grew up watching his father's dedication to service, spending evenings accompanying him on house calls, holding the medical bag, and learning early the meaning of duty to community. "I want to be like you, Dad," John had said one evening after they'd returned from treating a miner's son with pneumonia. His father had smiled tiredly and ruffled John's hair. "Find your own way to serve, son. There's more than one path to making a difference." That path became clear on December 7th, 1941, when John and his family gathered around the radio and heard President Roosevelt's voice declare that the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had created a date which will live in infamy. John was 17 then, a high school senior with decent but not exceptional grades, known more for his track abilities than his academic achievements. That night, he made his decision, announcing to his parents that he would seek appointment to West Point. His mother had cried, but his father nodded solemnly. "If that's your path, we'll support you." The local congressman had been a patient of Dr. Winters for years, and while he made no promises, he agreed to consider John for the appointment. The months that followed saw John transform his academic performance, staying up late studying mathematics and history, rising before dawn to run 5 miles to improve his physical conditioning. By spring, when the appointment came through, John had already begun to reshape himself into cadet material. "You'll need to be ready by July 1st, the congressman's letter stated. "The Academy has accelerated its program due to the war. You'll be part of the class of 1945, but you'll graduate in 1944. What John didn't fully comprehend was that this accelerated program meant condensing 4 years of military and academic training into just 3, with virtually no breaks. The traditional summer furloughs had been eliminated. The curriculum had been stripped to essential courses focused on warfare rather than broader education. While previous generations of cadets had time to adjust gradually to military life, John's class would be thrown into a pressure cooker of training designed to produce combat-ready officers as quickly as possible. His mother packed his single suitcase with the sparse items permitted by the Academy's instructions: a few changes of underclothes, a shaving kit, a Bible, and the required pair of black Oxford shoes, already broken in as instructed. She slipped in a photograph of the family, which technically wasn't allowed, but which John secretly welcomed. "The world needs leaders now," his father told him at the train station in Carterville. "But remember, a good leader knows when to follow orders, and when those orders might get his men killed." John didn't understand the significance of those words then, but they would echo in his mind on battlefields far from home, when traditional military doctrine collided with the chaotic realities of modern warfare. The journey to West Point had been long, 2 train changes and nearly 24 hours of travel. John had met other appointees along the way, young men from Pennsylvania coal country, Boston suburbs, California farmlands, and Texas ranches. They shared similar stories: the shock of Pearl Harbor, the desire to serve, the mixture of pride and terror at what awaited them. None of them were prepared for the reality of reception day at West Point during wartime. As John struggled to follow the seemingly nonsensical commands of the upperclassmen screaming in his face on that July morning, he caught glimpses of other new cadets experiencing the same disorientation. A tall, lanky boy from Nebraska fumbled his bag and earned extra scorn. A stocky former high school football player from Pennsylvania stood rigid, his face reddening with each new barked command. A slender young man from New York City maintained remarkable composure, having perhaps benefited from military school experience. "You are no longer civilians," bellowed the cadet captain, overseeing the initial formation. "From this moment, you are new cadets. You will speak only when spoken to. You will move only when ordered to move. You have exactly 30 minutes to say goodbye to your families and then report to Eisenhower Barracks." John scanned the crowd for his parents, but couldn't find them among the hundreds of family members gathered at the edges of the formation area. The accelerated wartime schedule meant many families, including his own, couldn't make the journey for our day. He was utterly alone in his transformation from civilian to military cadet. The next hours passed in a blur of activity so precisely choreographed and so foreign to civilian life that it seemed designed specifically to disorient. New cadets were herded from station to station. Medical examinations, uniform fittings, equipment issuance, paperwork processing, all conducted at double-time pace with no allowance for confusion or hesitation. At the barber shop, John watched as his carefully maintained hairstyle fell to the floor in clumps, replaced by a standardized military cut that reduced all the young men to a uniform appearance. The barber took just under 2 minutes per cadet, the clippers buzzing efficiently as he worked through the line of new arrivals. "Next," the barber called, and John moved forward automatically, already learning that hesitation brought unwanted attention. "How would you like it cut, sir?" the barber asked with a smirk. Before John could answer, an upperclassman shouted, "He's not a sir, he's nothing, and he wants it cut exactly like everyone else's." By noon, John had surrendered his civilian clothing, donned the gray uniform of a West Point cadet, and begun learning the first elements of military bearing. The transformation was so abrupt that when he caught a glimpse of himself in a window reflection, he momentarily failed to recognize the rigid, uniform-clad figure staring back at him. The true character-building ordeal began after lunch, a meal during which new cadets were required to sit at rigid attention, take measured bites, and chew each mouthful precisely 20 times. John managed only a few hurried bites before the meal ended, his stomach knotting with hunger and anxiety. "Fall in, new cadets!" The command echoed across the courtyard, and 500 young men scrambled to form lines, most failing miserably at their first attempt. "Pathetic!" shouted the upperclassman. "You call that a formation? My grandmother's sewing circle shows more discipline. Again!" As the afternoon heat intensified, the new cadets repeated basic movements, facing movements, marching, and proper saluting, over and over until muscles burned and minds numbed. John's legs trembled with fatigue, but he dared not show weakness. Around him, he noticed several appointees already breaking down, their civilian mindsets unable to adapt to the sudden immersion in military discipline. A young man 2 spots ahead of John in formation began to sway visibly, his face pale with exhaustion. "I don't think I can do this," he whispered to no one in particular. "Silence in the ranks," came the immediate response from a passing upperclassman who seemed to have supernatural hearing. "Drop and give me 20 push-ups, new cadet." The struggling appointee managed only 7 before collapsing. By evening, he and 11 others had withdrawn from the academy, unable to withstand even the first day of Beast Barracks, the 7-week initial training that would transform civilians into West Point cadets. In 1942, Beast Barracks took on a new intensity. The traditional training had been compressed and focused specifically on preparing young men for immediate war service. What had once been a gradual adjustment to military life became a crucible of compressed experience designed to quickly identify those who lacked the mental and physical stamina for officer training. As dusk approached on that first day, John found himself in New Cadet Company D, assigned to a Spartan room in the imposing stone barracks. He shared the space with 3 other exhausted appointees: Richard Harrington from Boston, whose father had served in the First World War; Thomas Schultz from Milwaukee, a senator's son with previous military school experience; and James Cooper from rural Georgia, whose quiet demeanor masked a fierce determination. "My brother's already fighting in North Africa," Cooper said quietly, as they arranged their meager belongings according to the precise instructions they'd been given. "Says the officers make all the difference between living and dying out there." Harrington nodded. "My cousin died at Pearl, Navy lieutenant. Good man by all accounts." "We've got a lot to live up to," Schultz added, carefully aligning his shoes at the exact angle specified in the cadet manual. John remained silent, feeling the weight of expectation settling on his shoulders. The world was burning, and they were being forged in this pressure cooker to help extinguish the flames. The magnitude of the responsibility was almost crushing. A sharp knock on the doorframe jolted them all to attention. An upperclassman, a firstie or senior cadet, stood in the doorway, his gray uniform immaculate, his bearing impossibly precise. "At ease, new cadets," he said, his voice surprisingly calm compared to the shouting they'd endured all day. "My name is Cadet Captain William Mitchell. I'll be your company commander during Beast. The next 7 weeks will be the hardest of your lives." Mitchell paced slowly around the room, inspecting their unpacking progress with a critical eye. "Normally, you'd have 4 years at the academy to become officers. The war has given you 3. That means everything is accelerated. The academics, the military training, the physical conditioning. Many of you won't make it to graduation. Some will crack under the pressure. Others won't meet academic standards." He paused, making eye contact with each new cadet. "But those who remain will join the finest officer corps in the world at a time when our nation needs leaders more than ever before. Remember that when you're exhausted, when you're frustrated, when you're ready to quit, the men you will someday lead deserve your absolute best." With that, Mitchell departed, leaving a momentary silence in the room. "Well," Harrington said finally, "at least we know what we're in for." Little did they know that the traditional Beast Barracks experience had been fundamentally altered by the war. In peacetime, the program focused on discipline, military courtesy, and gradual indoctrination into cadet life. But the 1942 version had been redesigned with the urgent reality of global conflict in mind. These cadets would face challenges no previous class had encountered. At precisely 2100 hours, 9 p.m. civilian time, lights out was called. John lay on his narrow bed, every muscle aching, his mind racing despite his physical exhaustion. Through the window, he could see the Hudson River gleaming in the moonlight, the same view that generations of cadets had observed since the Academy's founding in 1802. But unlike those generations, his class would have no time for gradual development or tradition for tradition's sake. They were being processed, not cultivated, shaped by necessity into the officers the Army desperately needed to lead in history's largest global conflict. John closed his eyes, wondering if he had what it took to survive the crucible he'd entered. Around him, hundreds of other new cadets likely wondered the same thing. What none of them yet realized was that the traditional West Point approach to military leadership was being rapidly reassessed in the face of modern warfare's realities. The rigid doctrine taught at the Academy for decades was proving insufficient for the fluid, mechanized combat of World War II. The very traits Beast Barracks had traditionally sought to instill, unquestioning obedience, adherence to established tactics, and methodical execution of orders, were sometimes proving disastrous on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. The dawn horn blasted at 5:30, jolting John from a fitful sleep. Instantly, the barracks erupted in activity as new cadets scrambled to make their beds with hospital corners, dress in their uniforms, and prepare for morning inspection, all within the 20 minutes allotted. "Move, new cadets! This isn't a leisure resort!" The thundering voice of an upperclassman echoed through the hallway. John fumbled with his uniform, fingers still clumsy with the unfamiliar buttons and insignia. Beside him, Schultz dressed with practiced efficiency, his military school background evident in his movements. "Need help?" Schultz whispered, quickly showing John how to align the brass buttons properly. "Thanks," John murmured, grateful for the assistance, but aware that such collaboration might be viewed as weakness by their trainers. The day that followed introduced the new cadets to the physical demands of West Point training. A 5-mile run before breakfast, executed in formation at a punishing pace, left many gasping for breath and a few vomiting at the roadside. Then came calisthenics, endless push-ups, sit-ups, and jumping jacks designed to push young bodies to their limits. "You think this is tough?" bellowed the physical training instructor. "Try charging up a beach with machine gun fire cutting down your platoon. Move those bodies like your lives depend on it, because someday they will." By noon, John's muscles screamed with fatigue, but he forced himself to maintain form. Around him, he noticed the first real separations beginning to emerge. Some new cadets were already finding their rhythm in this demanding environment, adapting to the pace and precision required. Others struggled visibly, their movements becoming increasingly uncoordinated as exhaustion set in. During the brief lunch period, John sat with his roommates, all too tired to speak much. At a nearby table, he noticed a commotion as an upperclassman berated a new cadet for some infraction. "Your left from your right, new cadet Parker. Men will die if you can't tell your left from your right." The hapless Parker, a slight young man with glasses, stood at attention while being dressed down, his face flushed with humiliation. John felt a pang of sympathy, knowing it could easily have been him receiving such treatment. "Don't look," Harrington whispered. "You'll draw attention." The afternoon brought classroom instruction, not the engineering or history courses that would come later, but the fundamental knowledge every cadet was expected to memorize: the chain of command, the cadet honor code, proper forms of address for different ranks, and the rich traditions of West Point. "The cadet honor code is simple," their instructor explained. "A cadet will not lie, cheat, or steal, nor tolerate those who do. This isn't just an academic exercise, gentlemen. In combat, your men's lives will depend on your integrity. If you say a position is secure, it had better be secure. If you report enemy strength, that report had better be accurate." Honesty isn't just a virtue at West Point, it's a tactical necessity. As evening approached, John's group was marched to the weapons training area, where they received their first instruction on the M1 Garand rifle, the standard infantry weapon of American forces in World War II. Under normal circumstances, weapons training would have been introduced gradually over weeks. In the accelerated wartime program, new cadets were expected to achieve basic proficiency in days. "This weapon will be your best friend and your responsibility," explained the tactical officer, a captain who had recently returned from combat in North Africa. Unlike the upperclassmen who seemed to delight in creating stress, The captain spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had seen war firsthand. "I know what you've been told about military doctrine and proper procedure," he continued, his voice dropping slightly so that the cadets had to lean forward to hear. "But I'm going to tell you something they don't put in the manuals. In combat, things rarely go according to plan. The officers who succeed are the ones who can adapt when everything goes to hell." John noticed several upperclassmen shifting uncomfortably at this departure from orthodox instruction. The captain caught their reaction and added, "Don't misunderstand me. The discipline and procedures you're learning here are vital, but rigid thinking gets men killed. Remember that." The captain's words struck John as significantly different from the unwavering adherence to doctrine that had been emphasized throughout the day. It was his first glimpse of the tension that existed between traditional military education and the evolving realities of modern warfare, a tension that would define his West Point experience. By the end of that second day, 23 more appointees had withdrawn or been dismissed for failing to meet the basic standards. The attrition was deliberate, part of the process of identifying those who lacked the physical stamina, mental acuity, or emotional resilience to serve as officers in wartime. As John collapsed onto his bed that night, Cadet Captain Mitchell made his rounds again, pausing at their door. "2 days down, new cadets," he said. "How are you holding up?" "Fine, sir," they responded in unison, the proper response regardless of how they actually felt. Mitchell nodded, then said something unexpected. "My brother graduated in the June accelerated class this year. He's already in England with the 8th Air Force. Wrote me last week about leading men 5 years older than him. Said West Point taught him everything about military procedure and nothing about managing scared men thousands of feet above German territory." The captain paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. "The academy is changing, even if it doesn't know it yet. Pay attention to what works in the field, not just what's in the textbooks." With that cryptic advice, he continued his rounds, leaving John and his roommates to ponder his words as they drifted into exhausted sleep. The days that followed blurred together in a grueling routine designed to break down civilian individuality and rebuild each cadet as part of a disciplined military unit. Morning runs became progressively longer. Classroom instruction intensified. Weapons training advanced from basic handling to marksmanship. And through it all, the upperclassmen maintained relentless pressure, correcting every minor infraction, demanding precision in all things. By the end of the first week, John had lost 7 pounds, developed blisters on both feet, and mastered the art of field stripping an M1 rifle blindfolded. He had also witnessed the departure of 43 more new cadets who couldn't withstand the physical or mental demands of beast barracks. "They're washing out the weak links," Cooper observed one evening as they polished their brass insignia for the next day's inspection. "Better here than in combat," John nodded, though privately he wondered about the criteria being used to determine who stayed and who went. Physical strength was obviously important, but he had noticed that some of the most physically capable new cadets struggled with the mental aspects of training, the ability to absorb and apply tactical knowledge under pressure. Conversely, some of the less imposing cadets demonstrated remarkable adaptability and quick thinking in simulated combat scenarios. This observation came into sharp focus during their second week, when the tactical training shifted from basic drill to small unit tactics. The new cadets were divided into squads and given a series of increasingly complex challenges that required coordination and decision-making under pressure. John's squad was led by Parker, the same cadet who had been berated for confusing left and right during the first week. To everyone's surprise, Parker proved to be an innovative tactical thinker, developing approaches to the training scenarios that weren't in the field manual, but achieved the objectives more efficiently. "Parker, what the hell are you doing?" demanded their tactical officer during one exercise. "That's not standard procedure for clearing a defended position." "No, sir," Parker replied, standing at attention. "But given our limited ammunition and the exposed approach, I believed a flanking maneuver would reduce casualties while achieving the objective." The officer frowned, then nodded reluctantly. Not by the book, but effective. Carry on. John watched this exchange with interest, noting that Parker's unorthodox approach had indeed solved the tactical problem more effectively than the prescribed method. It was another example of the tension between doctrine and improvisation that seemed to run through their training. This tension became explicit during their third week when their company received a new tactical officer, Major Robert Davidson, recently returned from the Pacific Theater, where he had commanded an infantry company on Guadalcanal. Davidson's approach differed markedly from the standard West Point methodology. "Forget half of what you've been taught about set-piece engagements," Davidson told them during his first tactical lecture. "The Japanese don't read our field manuals. They don't attack when and where doctrine says they should. And if you try to fight them according to textbook procedures, they will outmaneuver and kill you." A hushed silence fell over the classroom. Such direct contradiction of academy teaching was unprecedented. "Sir," ventured one brave cadet, "are you saying the tactical doctrine is wrong?" Davidson considered the question carefully. "Not wrong, incomplete. The fundamentals are sound, but their application must be flexible. The enemy gets a vote in how battles unfold, gentlemen. Your ability to adapt when plans go awry will determine whether your men live or die." John wrote these words in his notebook, underlining them twice. They resonated with what his father had told him about leadership, and with the hints Cadet Captain Mitchell had dropped during his evening rounds. The following day, Major Davidson introduced a new element to their tactical training: uncertainty. Rather than providing clear objectives and parameters for each exercise, he deliberately withheld critical information, forced squad leaders to make decisions with incomplete intelligence, and unexpectedly changed scenarios mid-exercise. "Incoming artillery," Davidson would shout without warning during a routine patrol exercise. "Lieutenant wounded, new chain of command." The resulting chaos was educational. Some cadet squads fell apart, unable to adapt to the changing circumstances. Others maintained cohesion but struggled to modify their plans. A few, including Parker's squad with John as second in command, demonstrated remarkable resilience, quickly reorganizing and continuing toward their objectives despite the disruptions. "This isn't how tactical problems are supposed to be structured," complained one cadet during the after-action review. "No, it isn't," Davidson agreed. "But it's how war actually works. The difference between good officers and great ones is their ability to function effectively when everything goes wrong." This approach was controversial among the academy staff. John overheard heated discussions between Davidson and other tactical officers who felt he was undermining the standardized curriculum. But Davidson had the moral authority of recent combat experience, and his methods continued, creating a pocket of unorthodox training within the otherwise traditional Beast Barracks program. As the fourth week began, the physical and academic demands intensified further. New cadets now routinely marched with full packs, sometimes covering 15 miles in a single day. Classroom instruction expanded to include communications, logistics, and military history, with special emphasis on the ongoing campaigns in Europe and the Pacific. The attrition continued as well. Each day seemed to claim another few cadets who couldn't meet the standards or chose to withdraw. By mid-August, John's original group of 500 had been reduced to just over 400. Those who remained had been transformed, physically hardened, mentally focused, and increasingly indoctrinated into the West Point ethos of duty, honor, and country. Yet within this transformation, John noticed an interesting divergence. The cadets seemed to be separating into two distinct groups: those who excelled at following orders precisely and maintaining perfect adherence to regulations, and those who demonstrated adaptability and creative problem-solving under pressure. Both groups performed well in different aspects of training, but they approached the challenges of leadership from fundamentally different perspectives. This divergence came to a head during the culminating exercise of Beast Barracks, a 3-day field problem that simulated combat operations in densely wooded terrain. Cadet companies were pitted against each other in a complex scenario involving reconnaissance, defensive operations, and finally, assault on an entrenched position. John's company was commanded by Thomas Schultz, who had emerged as a natural leader over the weeks of training. Schultz approached the exercise methodically, applying the principles of small unit tactics exactly as they had been taught. His planning was meticulous, his orders clear, and his execution of standard doctrine flawless. The opposing company was led by Parker, whose unorthodox thinking had continued to develop under Major Davidson's mentorship. Parker's approach was less structured, but more adaptive, emphasizing reconnaissance and flexible response rather than predetermined maneuvers. The contrast in leadership styles became apparent on the second day, when unexpected heavy rain turned the battlefield into a muddy quagmire. Schultz's carefully planned operations became increasingly difficult to execute as communications broke down and units lost their positioning in the poor visibility. "By maintain formation and continue as planned," Schultz ordered, determined to follow through with the established approach despite the changing conditions. Meanwhile, Parker's company adapted quickly to the weather, breaking into smaller, more mobile units that could navigate the difficult terrain more effectively. They used the reduced visibility to infiltrate between Schultz's more rigid formations, creating confusion and ultimately surrounding the command post. By the exercise's end, the result was clear. Parker's adaptive leadership had thoroughly outmaneuvered Schultz's textbook approach. During the after-action review, Major Davidson made the lesson explicit. "Doctrine exists for a reason," he told the assembled cadets. Mud-splattered and exhausted from their 3 days in the field, it represents the collected wisdom of generations of military experience. But doctrine is a starting point, not an end point. The truly effective officer knows both when to follow it precisely and when to improvise based on the actual conditions they face. John reflected on these words as Beast Barracks drew to a close. He had arrived at West Point expecting to be taught absolute certainties about military leadership, clear rules and procedures that, if followed correctly, would lead to success in combat. Instead, he was discovering that effective leadership was more nuanced, requiring both disciplined adherence to fundamentals and the flexibility to adapt when circumstances demanded it. This lesson would prove crucial in the years ahead. The officers who graduated from West Point's accelerated wartime program faced combat environments of unprecedented complexity, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the mountains of Italy, from the islands of the Pacific to the skies over Germany. Those who survived and succeeded were invariably those who balanced doctrinal knowledge with adaptability. As August ended and the academic year began, John Winters and his fellow survivors of Beast Barracks were formally accepted into the Corps of Cadets. The ceremony was brief and subdued compared to peacetime years, another concession to the accelerated wartime schedule. But as John recited the cadet oath, pledging to defend the Constitution and bear true faith and allegiance to his country, he felt the weight of responsibility settling firmly on his shoulders. He glanced at the faces around him, Harrington, Schultz, Cooper, Parker, and hundreds of others who had endured the crucible of Beast Barracks. Some would excel in the rigid academic environment of West Point. Others would struggle with the formal coursework, but demonstrate remarkable leadership in field exercises. All of them would be shaped by the unique circumstances of their wartime education, the compressed schedule, the urgent necessity, and the evolving understanding of what effective military leadership required in modern warfare. 2 years later, in June 1944, John Winters graduated with the accelerated class, receiving his commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army. 2 weeks after graduation, Allied forces landed at Normandy, beginning the liberation of Western Europe. By autumn, John was in France, commanding a platoon of the 4th Infantry Division as they pushed toward Germany. The platoon sergeant assigned to him was Staff Sergeant Michael Collins, a combat veteran 10 years his senior who had fought in North Africa and Sicily. During their first meeting, Collins eyed the fresh-faced lieutenant warily. West Point? He asked, noticing John's class ring. Yes, Sergeant. Class of 44, though we started as 45 before the acceleration. Collins nodded. Had a West Pointer before you. Good man by the book. Got himself and 12 others killed trying to take a hill exactly the way the manual said it should be done. John absorbed this information quietly. I understand, Sergeant. I'd like to hear your assessment of our current situation and your recommendations before I issue any orders. A flicker of surprise crossed Collins' weathered face. That's not what I expected, Lieutenant. We were taught that an officer who doesn't listen to his NCOs is a fool, John replied, particularly when the NCO has seen more combat in the last year than I might see in my entire career. It wasn't strictly what they had been taught at West Point. Traditional instruction emphasized the unquestioned authority of the officer, but it was what John had learned from Major Davidson and from observing the contrast between rigid and adaptive leadership during Beast Barracks. In the months that followed, John's platoon developed a reputation for effective operations that minimized casualties while achieving objectives. His willingness to balance doctrinal approaches with battlefield adaptability, to know when to follow the book precisely and when to improvise, saved lives and accomplished missions in the brutal fighting through the Hurtgen Forest and the Battle of the Bulge. After the war, when asked about his leadership philosophy, Lieutenant Colonel John Winters would often trace it back to those first days at West Point during the summer of 1942. Beast Barracks taught me discipline, attention to detail, and the importance of standards, he would explain. But it also taught me, somewhat unintentionally, that effective leadership isn't about blind adherence to doctrine. It's about understanding principles deeply enough to know when and how to adapt them to reality. This insight, hard-won during the compressed intensive training of wartime West Point, would influence a generation of military leaders who faced the complex challenges of the post-war world. The lesson wasn't that military doctrine was wrong or unnecessary, but that its application required judgment, adaptability, and moral courage, especially when lives hung in the balance. As former Secretary of State and retired General Colin Powell would later put it, there are no secrets to success. It is the result of preparation, hard work, and learning from failure. For the cadets who experienced Beast Barracks during World War II, that learning began on their very first day at West Point, when the traditional met the practical, and future leaders discovered that courage sometimes meant knowing when to break from tradition in service of a higher purpose. The experience of those wartime cadets, their accelerated education, their exposure to combat veterans who challenged orthodox thinking, and their rapid transition from civilians to officers in a global conflict, fundamentally shaped the development of American military leadership. They became the bridge between the old Army, with its emphasis on set-piece battles and rigid procedures, and the new Army that would face the fluid, asymmetric challenges of the Cold War and beyond. Looking back on that first day at West Point, the shock of immersion in military discipline, the physical demands, the mental pressure, John Winters would remember not just the hardship, but the purpose. They were breaking us down to build us up, he would explain to his grandchildren decades later. But the strongest leaders emerged not because they could follow orders perfectly, but because they understood when following the rules and when breaking them would best serve the mission and the men. Today, the United States Military Academy continues this tradition of rigorous training, though the specifics have evolved to meet the changing nature of warfare. Beast Barracks remains a challenging initiation for new cadets, designed to test their resolve and begin their transformation into military leaders. But the fundamental lesson remains the same. Effective leadership requires both disciplined adherence to principles and the moral courage to adapt when circumstances demand it. It's a lesson written in the sweat of cadets, on the plain at West Point, in the mud of European battlefields, and in the blood of those who learned too late that courage sometimes means questioning doctrine when lives are at stake. For the young men who entered West Point during those critical years of World War II, Reception Day was more than just the beginning of their military careers. It was the first step in redefining what military leadership would mean for generations to come. They entered as civilians and emerged as officers, forged in the crucible of a compressed wartime education that demanded both discipline and adaptability, a combination that would prove essential on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, and in the complex conflicts that followed. The legacy of those wartime cadets lives on in the leadership principles taught at West Point today, principles that still balance the timeless values of duty, honor, and country with the practical recognition that effective leadership is as much about moral courage and adaptability as it is about doctrine and discipline. Would you have the courage to follow orders when they align with your training, or the wisdom to recognize when those orders might lead to disaster? It's a question that every military leader must answer, and one that began to form in the minds of cadets like John Winters on their very first day at West Point during World War II. Remember these unsung heroes who learned to balance tradition with innovation, doctrine with reality, and in doing so, helped shape the military leadership that would guide America through its most challenging conflicts. Share their story so others understand what courage really means, not just the physical bravery to face danger, but the moral courage to lead wisely when lives depend on your judgment.